series of 5 videos that you are about to watch represent the culmination of nearly 20 years research by the Institute of Terrestrial Ecology. The objective of this research was to combat deforestation by the domestication of indigenous trees for an enhanced production of timber and non-timber forest products. Vegetative propagation by stem cuttings represents a simple technique for the capture of genetic variation and the production of commercial varieties of traditionally important tree species. Thus, vegetative propagation can be seen as the key to the rehabilitation of degraded tropical ecosystems and as a means of promoting the economic development of rural communities. The videos, which were filmed on location in Cameroon, Kenya and Costa Rica, focus on projects funded by the UK Overseas Development Administration and show the wide application of vegetative propagation. They, like the associated manual, illustrate the different stages of the propagation process. In addition, the first video sets the scene by looking at the causes and effects of deforestation and the need to stimulate replanting of trees.
The tropics. And many people think of exotic wildlife and dense vegetation. However, tropical trees also grow in farmland and around villages, and scattered over pastures and savanna, as well as in plantations. To local people, these trees are an everyday sight, often taken for granted. To others, they have been regarded as a quick source of foreign exchange to be exploited, or alternatively, as a nuisance to be cleared out of the way. All over the tropics, the older trees are being cut down much faster than young ones are growing up to replace them. Many people are realizing that there are not as many trees in their area as when they were younger, and may even be aware that there are fewer than last year. Indeed, some quite large areas have been completely cleared of trees, and the people have had to move away. In reality, however, tropical trees, woodlands and forests are best seen as rich and valuable natural resources that can provide a great range of benefits in perpetuity if they are managed properly. The main aim of these programs is to explain why the rapid loss of trees matters greatly in the tropics and to the rest of the world, and to describe new opportunities for growing more and better trees by using the techniques of vegetative propagation and direct genetic selection. These propagation methods have been developed so that they can be applied anywhere in the humid and semi-arid tropics. They suit hundreds of kinds of trees, including multi-purpose trees, traditional plantation species, and the many others that may be important in your area. They can be used by anyone, for example by individuals or communities in farmland, near homes and in fuelwood plots, or by government departments and private companies in plantations to replenish logged forests. There are many reasons why tropical trees are disappearing. Clearing forests and woodlands is no longer a long, laborious affair. Today, an array of highly effective machinery and vehicles is available, and chainsaws are easily obtained. Large tracts of tropical forest are being cut down to make way for roads, towns, and industrial and rural development. Many hardwood trees are cut by logging companies to be sold abroad. Growing human populations are putting greater pressure on the land for the raising of livestock and the production of staple foods. In farms using shifting cultivation, the resting period under tree fallow gets shorter and shorter. Some land is turned over to growing cash crops for export, or a few selected forestry species. These have generally been planted pure and not mixed together, and they are seldom indigenous tree species. The most important problem of all has been the over-concentration on short-term economic calculations, the lack of a proper value given to tropical forest trees, which acts as a strong disincentive to plant them, and finally, the little attention paid to the environment, sustainable management and conservation of natural resources. So why does the loss of trees matter? Many people throughout the world are beginning to realize that the disappearance of so many trees from the tropical environment really does matter. Firstly, local people in tropical regions lose the regular continuing harvests of a very wide variety of useful products that they've depended on to meet their needs. Products such as food or medicines for themselves and their domesticated animals. Or, very important in some areas, fuel for cooking. And for many kinds of essential domestic requirements. For it is not just timber that forest trees produce. Many of the non-timber products can no longer be collected from the wild once they have been overexploited, or if the bigger trees creating the forest have been taken away. Secondly, the soil in large clearings that lack the protection of forest trees generally becomes degraded and non-productive. Natural forests are well-balanced and self-perpetuating communities of plants and animals. They maintain and improve soil fertility and protect the land from erosion. They also allow water to percolate into the soil and to be recycled back into the atmosphere. But where the trees have been removed, we find the erosion and washing away of fine particles of soil and the loss of vital nutrients. The wholesale erosion of tons of soil makes the area useless. Also at risk is the biodiversity of many living organisms, including those whose presence is essential for the community to function properly. Moreover, the most desirable timber trees are often cut, leaving behind only a few individuals of inferior quality. Species that could supply the future needs of mankind, perhaps yielding a valuable medicine, might be wiped out entirely. Thus, although extensive clearance may provide items such as logs, crop yields, or meat in the short term, this is usually at the expense of losing valuable resources in the long term. People are now becoming aware that large-scale systems of agricultural production are turning out to be non-sustainable, or at least dependent upon expensive fertilizers and pesticides. The same is also true where pasture lands have been overgrazed, and many small holdings are producing less and less because of the loss of trees. Indeed, except for rice on freshwater swamps, it looks as though forest trees may be crucial to farming in the humid tropics, either as an integral part of the cropping system or after it as a fallow period. This is partly because they protect the soil and maintain conditions where nutrients are recycled instead of being washed away. In drier parts of the tropics too, trees play a similar crucial role in soil protection, also providing fruits and vital fodder supplies during the dry season. In mangrove swamps, there is an indirect connection with human food supplies. Overcutting means that not enough small trees establish themselves so that the forest becomes degraded. This not only threatens future supplies of wood, but also the rich fishing grounds in the river estuaries, which are dependent on the mangrove community. In addition to these local effects of deforestation, there can be regional and global consequences. For example, excessive flooding and silt deposition can be caused by extensive forest clearance somewhere upstream. There is also evidence now that deforestation can affect the patterns and amount of rainfall hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers away. Because so many tropical trees have already been lost, it is even possible that the climatic stability of the whole world is being adversely affected by the release of millions of tons of carbon that were previously locked away in their wood. The challenge is to develop new ways and rediscover old systems by which the land can continue to yield many useful items in perpetuity. Managing it sustainably means that its capacity to produce today must be kept in balance with the needs of many tomorrows. But how can one get back to the position where there are enough forest trees throughout the tropics? Finding answers to this question is in our own interests and also those of our children and grandchildren. Something everyone, men, women, teenagers and children, can do is to become involved in planting and growing trees, especially in small and varied groups on degraded land. Fortunately for the tropics, there are many kinds of trees to choose from, including some that can protect the soil and restore its fertility quite rapidly. Every extra tree planted as part of a sustainable system is an important step taken to maintain or replace a valuable natural resource, or to restore degraded land. It can also help by providing an alternative to using natural forests, and so protect the diversity of species and life forms they contain. In this way, some forest and savannas can be kept that are still relatively unchanged. The process of vegetative propagation means producing new plants directly from parts of existing ones, instead of from seeds. All the trees derived from one tree, the original stockplant, are genetically identical copies of it and are called clones. Many tropical fruit and food crops are grown in this way. Because the process is easy and repeated frequently, farmers have long ago learnt to use pieces from individual plants that had desirable characteristics when planting the next crop. The clones that are most desirable have been domesticated by selection and propagation and are readily available today. They outproduce by far the original wild varieties. Over a shorter period, yields of woody crop plants such as rubber, coffee, tea and mango have similarly been greatly increased by selection and vegetative propagation. Up to now, however, most tropical forest trees have been left in their wild state, and selection has only reached an early stage in the few plantation species that have been worked on. There are in fact several quite daunting problems that hamper the next steps in their improvement by breeding. But now, these well-known approaches can be combined with recently adapted techniques of vegetative propagation to domesticate most kinds of tropical trees much more quickly. The advantages of using vegetative propagation are firstly that plenty of young trees can be produced for planting at any time, even when flowering does not occur, or when there are problems with seed collection, viability, germination or storage. Secondly, the selection, testing and multiplying of superior clones can be done more quickly than with traditional breeding. The genetic diversity already existing amongst the individual trees of a species can be captured directly without the characters being changed. Selecting the most suitable clones will improve the quality of the trees that are being grown, and new clones can be incorporated as they become available. The techniques that have been developed are very straightforward, and the plants that are produced can be handled afterwards in the same way as nursery seedlings. Expensive equipment is not required, as very good results can be achieved in the recently developed poly-propagator, an example of appropriate technology which is built with materials that are usually available locally. Suitable shoots are taken from specially grown stock plants, and small leafy cuttings are then put into these special propagation frames to develop roots. Although the methods are not complicated, care is needed, as there are many points at which things can go wrong. However, by following the processes outlined in these video programs and the manual, you should avoid most of the fundamental problems. This video series is divided into 5 sections, of which this is the first. Program 2 deals with the details of taking and handling leafy cuttings so that they will root successfully. Program 3 is concerned with how to construct and use a poly-propagator to provide a good rooting environment. Program 4 explains how to manage stock plants to get enough shoots that will be suitable as cuttings. And Program 5 describes ways of selecting promising trees to form clones to begin the process of genetic improvement. This final program returns to the vital question of how the domestication of trees can help us to develop environmentally sustainable and economically sound methods of land use that would benefit everyone in the tropics. A manual called Rooting Cuttings of Tropical Trees is also available, covering the subjects discussed in this video series in more detail. It is the first in a set called Tropical Trees, Propagation and Planting Manuals. The other manuals in the set cover seeds, nurseries, preparation for planting, and the successful establishment of tropical trees. They are being published by the Commonwealth Science Council in London. In this section, we shall be explaining how to root the leafy cuttings of tropical forest trees. These vegetative propagation techniques have been successfully applied to many different kinds of tropical forest tree in Latin America, East and West Africa, and Southeast Asia. Naturally, there are many more species that have not so far been tested, but 95% of those tried have rooted quite easily using leafy cuttings. There are two quite different types of cuttings that can root and form new trees. We shall call these leafless cuttings and leafy cuttings. Like many farm crops, certain kinds of forest tree can be rooted simply by pushing a sizable piece of leafless stem into the ground. This method is often used for hedging plants and living crop supports and some nitrogen-fixing plants. Planted during the rainy season, this type of cutting has the advantage of needing little attention. However, only relatively few tree species are known to succeed from these leafless cuttings. The best way to root cuttings of most tropical tree species is to use small leafy cuttings. Because soft shoots are used, the cuttings need to be maintained in very humid conditions to stop them from drying up and allow rooting. Like nursery stock raised from seed, they are then grown to the desired size and planted out. Since each cutting is usually quite small, this method also means that desirable strains and clones can be multiplied up to larger numbers of plants more quickly. There are several ways of keeping the leafy cuttings from drying up. With mist propagation, for instance, water under pressure is sprayed as a fine mist over the leaves. This is automatically controlled to moisten the leaves every few minutes. Another system is the bubble bath, in which cuttings are enclosed in a tank, with the lower parts of their stems placed in water that is aerated, as in a fish tank. Another, much simpler propagation system that does not need an expensive and complicated installation is the poly-propagator. This consists basically of a shaded, closed and watertight box, which is covered with transparent polythene sheeting. The cuttings are placed into a rooting medium, which is kept moist from beneath. The results are usually equally as good as or better than other systems, and the poly-propagators are relatively cheap and easy to build with locally available materials. This example of appropriate technology does not depend on electricity or piped water supply, and will be described more fully in Programme 3 of this video series. When rooting leafy cuttings, the most important thing to remember is that at no time should they be allowed to begin to dry off. This is because even before they start to wilt, the normal production of sugars in the leaves would be disturbed, interrupting the formation of roots. Later on, after the new plant has formed a good root system, it can be gradually hardened off to ordinary nursery conditions. There are 4 stages in the process of rooting leafy cuttings. They are preparation, collection, rooting, and aftercare. Careful preparation must not be overlooked. A shady, moist working place will be needed close to the poly-propagator, with the poly-propagator ready for use before taking the cuttings. The rooting medium should be moist but not too wet. Ideally, the shoots should be collected, the cuttings made and set in the poly-propagator and the lid closed before the heat of the day. You will need the following items: a bucket of clean water, some large polythene bags and a water sprayer, some sharp secateurs and scissors, a very sharp knife or razor blades, some record sheets, labels and pencils, and a copy of Volume 1 of the manual, or the relevant photocopied pages. The shoots and cuttings need to be kept damp and cool at all times to minimize the loss of water. To achieve this, it is useful to think about how to streamline all the stages so that they will run quickly and smoothly. The collection of leafy cuttings can be made from young nursery seedlings, but they usually come from special stock plants. These are trees that have been managed or hedged so as to produce plenty of the right kinds of shoots close to the ground rather than being allowed to grow tall. The shoots that make good cuttings are those which are growing vertically and quite vigorously. The cuttings will be made from leafy shoots that have recently expanded, although the very soft tips will need to be discarded. The more woody basal parts of the shoots, with some older leaves on them, will be left on the stock plant to provide reserves of sugars and nutrients for the next crop of shoots. Avoid using diseased or insect-infested shoots. If the leaves are large, they are best reduced in size to minimize water loss and make the cuttings easier to handle. Preferably, the leaves that are going to remain on the cuttings should be trimmed before the shoots are taken from the stock plant. As a rough guide, the total area of leaf blade left on each cutting should be about 50 square centimetres. This might, for example, be a rough circle 8 centimetres across, or a square 7 by 7 centimetres, but can be made up in any way. In several tropical trees, this leaf area has been found to provide enough of the sugars and other substances needed for the cutting to form roots, without the leaf suffering from water loss. However, if the leaf is very small or completely removed, the cutting quickly dies. Simple experiments can help to determine the optimum leaf size for any particular species. Once the shoots are ready, a moistened polythene bag should be prepared. Any kind of polythene bag will do, but the best have a white surface outside, which helps to reflect heat away. Bags should always be kept in the shade to keep them cool. Inside each bag there should be a label giving the clone and batch number. Each shoot should then be cut off and placed carefully in the bag, which is then closed and a second label attached on the outside. When the collection is finished, it is important to take the shoots as quickly as possible to the propagation nursery and to prevent the bags from heating up on the way. For long, hot journeys, an insulated cool box could be used. Ideally, the temperature should be between 15 and 20 degrees Celsius. Avoid temperatures of 10 degrees Celsius or below, and avoid any contact with ice. It is also important to avoid crushing or dropping the bags, as damage will increase the risks of infection and reduce rooting. The shoots should either be put into a bucket of water or removed one at a time from the bags, keeping them moist with a fine spray of water. With some plant species, secateurs can crush the stems. In such cases, use a very sharp blade. Make each cutting with a bud and a leaf near the top, plus enough stem below to anchor it into the rooting medium. Usually 4 to 8 centimetres long is best. Sometimes the internode, the clear stem between each leaf or leaf pair, is long enough to make single node cuttings. This will mean that you get the maximum number of cuttings out of your shoots. Where internodes are shorter, 2 or more nodes can be used per cutting, removing the leaves that would be under the rooting medium. The cuttings should only be handled in your shaded working area. Moreover, it is best to set the cuttings as soon as possible, but if necessary they can be kept for up to 1 day in cool, moist conditions. After 2 days they generally do not survive. To assist effective rooting, it is recommended that a rooting powder is used. Rooting powder contains plant hormones called auxins, which encourage a cut shoot to form roots. Although your cuttings may produce some auxins themselves, rooting is usually much quicker if you're able to add more. Rooting powder containing the auxin IBA is usually the best. Take out only a little rooting powder at a time and keep the rest dry. It also needs to be stored in a refrigerator, but not frozen. Using rooting powder results in better root systems, which in turn provide strong, vigorous nursery plants. The base of the cutting should then be dipped into the rooting powder to a depth of a few millimetres. Cuttings should then be set in the rooting medium without delay, with the top bud and leaf clear of the surface of the medium. They are best placed in lines to save space and to make it easier to check them. Holes in the rooting medium can be made at the time with a small stick or prepared beforehand with a nail board at an appropriate spacing. All the cuttings need firming in with the fingers. Each batch and clone needs to be identified with labels at both ends of the line of cuttings, written in pencil as ink will run or fade. A final spray with water is given before closing the lid of the poly-propagator, which is then kept shut as much as possible over the next 3 to 8 weeks. Records of the date and the number of cuttings of each clone or type that you have set will be required, together with the source of the cuttings and any treatments given. The poly-propagator should be checked early each morning, but opened as little as possible. You should spray water over the cuttings each time you open the poly-propagator, and every few minutes if you're working with the lid open. The main things to look for are whether there are still drops of water on the cuttings, showing that very high humidity is being maintained. The shading should ensure that the cuttings do not receive bright sun, and that the air temperature inside the poly-propagator does not go much above 30 degrees Celsius. Any dead cuttings and fallen leaves should be removed before they encourage rotting, together with any insect pests that might have appeared. Sometimes eggs on the leaves are difficult to see. Once the cuttings have begun to produce roots, which can take anything between 1 and 6 weeks or more, they should be carefully dug out one by one from the rooting medium. They should be potted up if the roots exceed 1 centimetre in total length, otherwise replaced in the medium. If cuttings are left in the propagator too long, they will form such long roots that they are difficult to lift and also difficult to pot. Because the rooting medium usually doesn't contain nutrients, cuttings that are left too long will go yellow. Such cuttings may eventually die. While potting up the cuttings, avoid damage to the root systems and keep the stems vertical. Rather than just using nursery soil, it's usually much better to prepare a special potting mixture that allows good aeration, maintains moisture content without waterlogging, and contains adequate mineral nutrients and organic matter. If your rooted cuttings fail to improve their colour and don't grow well after a few weeks, the application of mycorrhizal inoculum may help. A similar effect can sometimes be achieved by adding to the potting mix a little soil from under established trees of the same species. Because the rooted cutting has been grown in shade and high humidity, its tissues are soft and it would quickly die if placed straight into full sun. However, it can be transformed into a fully hardened nursery plant in gradual stages called weaning. The newly potted cuttings should be put back into a poly-propagator for about 1 week, while the roots are growing out and branching into the potting mixture. Then the young trees should be exposed step by step to drier conditions. First, the lid could be left open during the night, and then later also during the day, except during particularly hot, dry weather. After about 1 to 2 weeks of this, the pots can be transferred to shaded nursery beds and treated in the same way as seedling stock. If appropriate, further hardening can be achieved in the nursery by gradual and progressive removal of shading. As we saw in the previous programme, most tropical forest trees can be propagated as leafy cuttings. These small and relatively delicate plants would dry up in a matter of minutes unless kept moist. This is because water loss from the leaf is rapid and cannot be replaced quickly until new roots have formed. For the same reason, the air temperature should be carefully controlled by shading the propagation bed from direct sunlight. Once the rooted cuttings have been potted up, they are then gradually weaned from the humid conditions and hardened to withstand normal nursery and planting conditions. A simple and effective way of providing high humidity and a good rooting environment is the poly-propagator. This example of appropriate technology has been developed over several years and tested with a considerable number of tree species in different parts of the tropics. It does not require expensive equipment and can be constructed simply and relatively cheaply using materials available locally. In many cases, the results are equal to or better than rooting in more sophisticated propagation systems. The poly-propagator does not depend on an electricity supply or piped water, and so can be used by anyone growing trees anywhere in the tropics. Planning and preparation are extremely important factors, and the first step is to choose the best possible site for propagation. For example, this could be within an existing forest nursery. With a new site, look for somewhere with a gentle slope near to a clean, reliable water supply with no risk of flooding. Avoid rocky areas or places with heavy clay soils and poor drainage. Accessibility to a road is always a useful bonus, but not essential. It is valuable to keep some large trees around the site to give shade from the sun and shelter from the wind, but their branches should not overhang the work area. It might also be wise to think about protection from fire, wild or domesticated animals, thieves and vandals. It is important to plan the layout of the propagation area to allow easy transport of materials, shoots for propagation and potted plants. Poly-propagators can be of various shapes and sizes, built of wood, concrete or metal, and can be set on or off the ground. The principle of this simple propagator is the same as that of a sealed polythene bag. In other words, a closed, watertight polythene container into which the rooting medium, water and cuttings can be arranged and sealed off. Here we describe a basic pattern for a wooden poly-propagator resting on the ground. It measures 3 meters long, 1 meter wide and 1/2 to 1 meter high. You will require some durable termite-resistant wood, especially for the parts at or below ground level. If this is not available, the wood should be treated with a preservative that will not damage the plants. The recommended sizes and measurements of all the materials used in the propagator we are constructing can be found in the manual that goes with the video series. Modifications can be made to the design we are showing here to suit your own requirements, providing there is a sliding or hinged lid that closes tightly and securely. You will also need some heavy-duty clear polythene sheeting. This should measure about 15 meters long and 1.5 meters wide. The following materials will be needed to fill the poly-propagator: 1/2 cubic meter of small stones or rounded off pieces of cement blocks, 1/4 cubic meter of 5 to 10 millimeter gravel, and 1/4 cubic meter of coarse sand. It is best to wash all this filling material thoroughly before use. Finally, you will need an effective rooting medium. This is of particular importance, and we shall discuss it in detail later in the programme. After the site has been cleared and paths made, make the position for each poly-propagator as level as possible and smooth off the surface. When the wooden frame has been constructed, a thin layer of sand then needs to be spread over the ground to prevent the polythene sheeting from being pierced or stretched. It is best to position the poly-propagator lengthwise in an east-west direction, and also to remember to allow for possible future expansion of the propagation area. The single piece of polythene used for the base must have no holes whatever and should now be fitted. Smaller pieces of polythene sheet can be stapled together for the top and the sides, but one completely watertight piece must be used for the base so as to come up the sides to above the level of the rooting medium. This will keep the water inside from running away. When this is done, the polythene sheeting can be fastened to the inside of the wooden frame with staples or nails, but without making any holes in the base sheet. This needs to be left loose enough to hold the filling material without excessive strain. The lid can now be covered with polythene sheeting and all the loose ends trimmed off. To improve the seal where the lid fits the base, a strip of foam rubber or pad of folded polythene can be used. Once the site has been established, a sheltered work area will be needed for preparing cuttings and for potting them up when they've rooted. This is needed both to protect workers from the rain and the cuttings from the sun. Ideally, the whole propagation area should be shaded well above head height with a plastic shade cloth that allows through about 15 to 25% of sunlight and is supported on a wooden framework. Alternatively, each poly-propagator could be shaded, for instance, with palm leaves, but additional shading or hanging mats may be needed to stop early morning or late evening sunshine from reaching the cuttings directly. A layer of sand should be placed on the base sheet of polythene to protect it from being punctured. A layer of washed stones should then be carefully added, followed by washed gravel, making a total depth of about 20 centimetres. It is useful at this stage to put a short piece of bamboo or plastic pipe about 30 centimetres long in one corner. Clean water should then be added until it comes up to the surface of the gravel. A dipstick should be placed inside the pipe and the correct water level marked on it. The rooting medium is important and should be chosen carefully. You will require approximately 1/4 of a cubic metre. An inexpensive mixture of local materials can be made that provides the 3 basic properties of a good rooting medium. These are aeration, moisture retention, and consistency. Aeration provides the new roots with an adequate oxygen supply through air spaces within the medium. The rooting medium needs to remain moist without becoming waterlogged. The consistency of the rooting medium should allow the cuttings to be inserted easily, but keep them firmly supported and also permit free root growth. Do not add any fertilizer or nutrient-rich soil to the rooting medium, as it will encourage contamination with microorganisms. A good start can generally be made by mixing up equal proportions of coarse sand, grit or fine gravel with old sawdust. Note that if sand from the beach is used, it needs to be washed free of salt, while most sawdust must be left to weather in the open for about a year in order to cause a breakdown of toxic chemicals. Alternatively, coconut palm husks and the fibre from within partly rotted palm stems are both highly prized as rooting media. Once the rooting medium has been mixed, it should be shoveled into the poly-propagator and firmed down. A small amount of fungicide can be mixed with the water to minimize the risk of rotting. It is a good plan to try out the first poly-propagator by having a test run with several types of easy rooting species, for example, herbaceous plants. This will let you check whether all is well and also allow everyone to gain experience. After the trial period, it would be sensible to put in small batches of cuttings of different kinds of trees before moving on to more important propagation. As mentioned earlier, remember to keep the lid shut as much as possible, making checks early and late in the day. As well as maintaining the shading and removing sources of disease and pest attack, the water level needs to be looked at to make sure that very high humidity is being maintained. The polythene sheeting should be wiped clean regularly, as dust will reduce the amount of light reaching the cuttings, and any small holes should be repaired. The rooting medium may need to be renewed or replaced every 3 to 6 months. Poly-propagators will also be needed for weaning the rooted cuttings, and in addition they can be used for restoring wilted pot plants and for temporary storage of bare-rooted planting stock such as wildings. Now that good rooting is being obtained in the poly-propagator, we will examine in the next section how to obtain plenty of shoots for vegetative propagation. If the poly-propagator described in the previous section is to be kept well supplied with cuttings for rooting, we now need to consider where these are to come from. Unfortunately, one cannot simply take any shoot from the desired tropical tree species and expect it to be suitable. Often, in fact, none of the hundreds of shoots on a sizable tree may be rootable at all. This means that, as soon as possible, special stock plants need to be grown to produce large numbers of the right kind of shoot, which will be harvested repeatedly to provide supplies of cuttings. The stock plants will probably also need to be regularly pruned or cut back to prevent them turning into large, single-stemmed trees. Choosing the right kind of shoot is an important key to success and probably the hardest part of vegetative propagation to get right. It depends upon several different features of the shoots. One of these is their age. For vegetative propagation, they need to be young or juvenile. Young seedlings are of course juvenile, but so in fact is the base of an older tree. In most woody species, once the shoots have grown to a height of more than about 1 metre, their tissues begin to lose the ability to root easily. This means that the whole crown of a big tree is generally useless for our purposes. Indeed, even if these shoots were to root or were grafted onto seedlings, the habit of growth of such adult plants might in any case be unsuitable for producing timber or poles due to being more spreading and branchy. On the other hand, if the trees were to be grown for their fruit or for shade, such a growth habit might be desirable. There are 3 basic types of stock plant that can produce juvenile shoots for cuttings to grow into tall timber trees. These are young seedlings, young coppice shoots from the stump of a tree that has been felled, or managed stock plants. These are repeatedly cut back to produce young shoots. In a few tree species, such as cordia, milicia, and some arid zone trees, juvenile suckers produced by cut roots can also be used as stock plants. The right type of shoot must be of the main stem type. They should be growing vertically with leaves arranged radially all around the stem. Branch-type shoots, particularly if the leaves are in 2 ranks on the sides, may not grow vertically after rooting. The stock plants generally need to be managed so that they continue to produce plenty of the main stem type of shoot, and the conditions under which the stock plant has been growing before the cuttings are taken makes a lot of difference to how well they will form roots. For instance, rooting is often better if the stock plants have been grown under moderate shade. This is because the amount and even the quality of light affect the internal conditions and structure of the shoots as they grow, and these in turn influence rooting. Other points concerning the stock plants that can make a difference to subsequent rooting include soil fertility, the addition of mulch or fertilizers, watering, and temperature. The number of competing shoots on each stock plant can also be important, the best cuttings coming from plants with few shoots. Features of the shoots to look out for are freshness, leafiness, vigour, and thickness. The stock plants should not have been subject to drought or other stress during the previous week, which might lessen the capacity of the cuttings to manufacture sugars and develop roots. The shoots that will be used for cuttings need to have leaves on them, but these should neither be just starting to expand nor old and yellowing. The shoots should preferably be quite vigorous when they've grown moderately quickly and have stems with fairly long internodes. Slowly grown shoots with short internodes may root less well, and sometimes extremely vigorous shoots will not root either. They tend to be too soft and quickly rot. Cuttings with moderately thin stems sometimes perform better than very thick ones, especially if the latter have become very woody. However, if the cuttings are rather thin, they should not also be very short. Pruning is usually necessary in order to keep the stock plants producing plenty of vigorous, young, juvenile shoots of the main stem type. Periodic harvesting of the shoots for cuttings helps towards this goal, but branch-type shoots need to be removed, and stems that are turning into leading shoots cut back. From time to time, it may also be necessary to prune the stock plant harder still, although it may be important to keep sufficient leaves on the stock plant to keep the root system alive. Sometimes one branch can be kept for this purpose. We call this a feeder branch. This will allow the stump to re-sprout rapidly and produce another crop of shoots. At this stage, the most important step is usually to build up the number of stock plants, and so the supply of shoots for the future. This means that many of the first rooted cuttings should be used for planting up a stock plant area. Frequently, this is done in lines, with the trees managed to produce a low-growing hedge. This is usually more successful than keeping them in traditional containers, in spite of the advantage of being able to move potted plants around. Potted plants generally grow more slowly, and their shoots are more liable to become stressed. When starting vegetative propagation, the first cuttings may well be taken from a batch of untested young seedlings. It is a good idea to keep the cuttings from each seedling separate and to give them a clone number. It would be a pity just to mix them all up together, because then one would never know which was from which clone. And each cutting is, of course, a copy of its source plant. Later on, one can come back to those clones that have performed best and multiply them up in large numbers as improved planting stock. Planning and planting a stock plant area is another important consideration. Choose a site which is relatively near at hand so that it's easy to check progress and to take the shoots quickly to the poly-propagator. It is also important to consider the risks of fire, flooding, browsing by animals, and interference by humans. A stock plant area should be sheltered and may well have some large shade trees left within it. Access to a reliable water supply is desirable so that planting of stock plants can continue in the dry season, and also to avoid interrupting the flow of new shoots for vegetative propagation. Because shoots that have been grown under moderate shade generally root better, it is a good idea to interplant the rows of stock plants with lines of small trees or shrubs with many small leaflets. This is better than shade cloth, as green leaves also alter the quality of the shade light. Leguminous species such as Lucina, Delonix and Calliandria have the added advantage that they fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it available in the soil. However, it may still be necessary to supplement this by the addition of standard NPK fertilizer, as nutrients will be removed from the stock plant each time shoots are harvested or pruned. When planting the stock plants, give them a good start by digging a fairly large hole and adding some good topsoil. Mulching between the rows will recreate soil conditions more like those within a forest, besides keeping down weed competition. For safety reasons, it is better not to put all the cuttings of one batch or clone at the same site. In addition, it's a good idea to plant 1 or 2 trees of each clone in a place where they can be left to grow tall. Then, if the existing stock plants should in time cease to produce juvenile shoots, these tall trees may be felled to provide a new set of coppice shoots. Building up the numbers of stock plants from small seedlings is rather slow at first. Obtaining coppice shoots from felled trees can be faster and a very effective method of producing suitable shoots for propagation. Trees of about 5 to 30 centimetres diameter are ideal. They can be felled and their stumps managed as stock plants. Because their root systems are large, coppice stumps usually produce many suitable shoots at a time. Regrowth is usually rapid, and coppice stumps may even produce shoots right through the dry season without watering. However, frequent attention is required to prevent them from growing too big. Protection from browsing animals, insects or vines may be needed. The selected tree should be felled with a slightly sloping cut so that rainwater does not collect on the cut surface and encourage the stump to rot. In order to stay within the juvenile part of the tree, The cut should be made quite near to the ground in small trees and not more than half a metre above ground level with larger ones. A sketch map and painted clone numbers will be helpful so that each stump can be found again and clearly identified. A second major advantage of coppice stumps is that before they are felled, the individual trees can be selected for certain characteristics such as tree form, wood quality, or pest and disease resistance. Or they could have been above average quality for production of fruit or fodder. At present, this method cannot easily be used to select trees that are likely to be superior for timber yield. All cuttings originating from a particular stump will be of the same selected clone and possess the same genetic potential. This is crucial to understanding why vegetative propagation is such an important tool, which will be explained further in the final program in the series. Tropical trees are as variable as tropical people. Everyone recognizes that some humans are taller or fatter than others, that individuals have diverse skills and knowledge, and that there are differences in eye and skin color. Some of these characteristics are strongly inherited, others are greatly influenced by the conditions under which the person has grown up. Thus, children show some features that are closely similar to their parents, but others that are specific to themselves. These differences are partly due to upbringing, but also happen because each child in the family has inherited different genetic characteristics. Only in identical twins do we find two people with exactly the same genetic potential as each other. Sometimes such twins might have been separated when very young, so that they grow up apart. In this case, the influences of upbringing and of inheritance can be more clearly separated and recognized. With plants, it's much easier to produce genetically identical individuals. Through vegetative propagation, we in effect produce many identical twins, or a clone, that is, a group of plants that are a genetic copy of the stock plant. We can then deliberately test the clones under different growing conditions to discover which characteristics are strongly inherited and which are primarily influenced by the environment. Expression of this genetic variation can also be identified by imposing treatments on young clonal plants. In this instance, branching frequency in response to pruning. Wherever they are grown, obvious differences can easily be recognized between clones of bananas, with their long, medium or short fruits of different colors and flavors. Because these fruiting characters are fixed within the clone, people have consciously chosen to plant each new banana crop with the type of banana that they want. So farmers have known for centuries just what to expect from their vegetatively propagated crop. Crops like coffee and cocoa have more recently been domesticated in a similar way. Up till now, however, these techniques have not been much used with tropical forest trees. One of the special advantages of vegetative propagation, together with this direct form of clonal selection, is that genetic improvement can be greatly accelerated. Moreover, the potential for finding superior individuals is very large. Most tropical tree species are very variable. This variation includes a lot of genetic differences. In order to understand how to take advantage of this variation, one needs to consider the difficulties that have hampered genetic improvement up to now. Traditional tree breeding is often difficult and slow because trees do not flower and fruit until they're quite old, so each generation takes many years. Furthermore, many characters do not show up for several years or decades, and even then they can be strongly influenced by environmental as well as genetical factors. Because tropical forest trees do not start flowering until they are tall trees, it's difficult to cross-pollinate them with other parent trees and to collect the seeds. When propagation is by seed, desirable features of the parent trees may not appear clearly, if at all, in the next generation. So being able to use direct selection and make copies of existing trees by vegetative propagation of juvenile clones is an important addition to the techniques available to forest geneticists and tree breeders, and allows them to get around some of these problems. In order to capture the genetic potential of a superior tree, it would be necessary to fell the tree and produce copious shoots for propagation. Selecting the best individuals to propagate is done by choosing trees that have desirable features that are strongly expressed. These may be sizable trees from about 10 to 30 meters tall. However, it is also very important to understand that domestication does not mean the elimination of unselected varieties or the original wild sources of a species, quite the reverse. As much variability as possible needs to be conserved in nature reserves and gene banks as a reservoir of genetic diversity that may be drawn upon in the future and used in longer-term breeding programs. It is also wise to mix well-tried varieties in with promising new types that have been little tested to increase the chances of success. When selecting sizable trees, one first needs to decide why and for what the trees are being grown, and therefore which characters to select. For timber trees, stem straightness and favourable branching habit might be chosen, while rapid sprouting and regrowth after felling would be desirable in trees grown for fuel or fodder. For fruit trees, early onset of flowering, regularity and yield of cropping, and quality and flavour of the fruits could be selected. Tolerance or resistance to pests and disease would be a bonus for all purposes. Since many of these characters are somewhat subjective, it is best if 2 or more people select the trees from the large number of possible candidates, accepting only the best for cloning. An important step in genetic selection, which should be taken as soon as there are plenty of rooted cuttings available, is to test the clones in field trials against a standard, unimproved set of seedlings. Those clones which are genetically superior will show up, and a mixture of several can then be firmly recommended for planting. It would not be sensible to use only a few clones, as any hidden genetic weakness could affect every tree of the clone. At each stage, from harvesting shoots from stock plants to potting rooted cuttings, the material of each clone must be labelled and kept separate from all the others. The best way is to finish working with one clone before starting on the next. It is very important to keep the clones separate and clearly identified, and thus to avoid mixing them up, as any confusion will be multiplied with each successive harvest. If the propagation is done without labels, It is impossible to make later selections from the clones that perform best in the field. Stock plants should be planted in clonal lines, separated from the next clone by a path or some interplanted shade plants. Lines will need labelling with the clone number, and it is important to make a simple sketch map of the layout with the dates of planting. The goal of this approach to tree improvement is to capture the characteristics of a single tree and produce genetically uniform copies, superior in yield and quality. Contrary to these examples of clonal eucalyptus, the application of this philosophy will require the development of systems that maintain biological diversity in a minimally disturbed ecosystem. In summary, the stages of domesticating a tree species are as follows. First, you'll need to spend time collecting, conserving and studying the natural diversity within the species concerned. Then choose the seed origins that thrive and perform best in the locality. Meanwhile, try and select individual trees that have characteristics that are above average. Fell these trees and convert the stumps into juvenile stock plants. Next, root plenty of cuttings from each selected clone and plant them as additional stock plants to bulk up the numbers. Once you have enough material, test the clones in a field trial and then use mixtures of 10 to 30 of the best clones for your planting. However, you must continue to look for and propagate new clones, including any from promising crosses and hybrids obtained through the slower process of breeding, so that you're adding new genetic variation to your clonal collection. Any batches of rooted cuttings that are not needed as stock plants can be used as planting stock. Again, it is well worth keeping a note of which clone is which, so that their progress can be followed. In species with severe seed problems, rooted cuttings may be the only plants available. In those under threat of extinction, rooted cuttings are even more important as an extra way of safeguarding or replacing the species. As the number of plants in tested clones increases, so the process of domestication of a tropical forest tree can move ahead more rapidly. In part, it involves greater selection and uniformity, but at the same time paying great attention to introducing and retaining plenty of diversity. In a similar way, wise choices need to be made about which tree species to grow, while also remembering the many different kinds of product and forms of protection that various other trees offer. It is especially important to plant trees in a way that as far as possible mimics natural forest. Trees of several different sizes, shapes and species mixed together will be more likely to possess the capacity to recycle nutrients and water, protect the soil and produce organic materials. This provides a basic guideline towards methods of land use that are sustainable, and beyond that to management that progressively increases future yields and quality, but also minimizes the risk of some ecological disaster. If we look back at the 5 video programs in this series, we have seen that most tropical forest trees can be rooted from leafy cuttings taken from juvenile stock plants. These can then be potted up and weaned from the high humidity and shade of the propagating conditions and hardened as ordinary nursery plants. The techniques are straightforward, and poly-propagators can be constructed easily using materials available locally. Provided that the stock plants are juvenile and are managed properly, they can produce shoots of the right kind for repeated batches of cuttings. Finally, the selection of specific clones gives us a unique opportunity to supplement seedling planting stock with genetically superior trees. The techniques you have been watching in this series of programs are likely to apply to most tropical trees for whatever purpose you wish to grow them. These techniques can be used by anyone on a small, medium or large scale. Estimates suggest that tropical forest trees have been disappearing at the rate of about 1 million a day. These fresh approaches provide a much-needed tool to allow many people to plant useful trees that benefit both themselves and the environment. Replacing trees faster than we remove them and making sure that they are of an appropriate kind and quality makes obvious sense for each of us, our neighbours, and the fragile world we live in.